That scream is making me laugh. Because it doesn't fit at all. He should be like screaming in agony or fear or something. He's just like, ah. So for one reason or another, I decided to try out Star Wars Jedi Survivor, despite the fact I never played the first game. So that's one thing you should know going in. The other thing you should know is I'm not going to talk about the various performance issues that you've likely heard about in literally any other review of this game, except for right now and during the conclusion. The short version is the game runs kinda shitty on console, but way more shitty on PC. Even if you have a beastly 4090, if you don't have a Ryzen 9 to match it, apparently the game just runs like complete shit. I have no idea why, and I don't really care about the technical side of things. Now, because I use my PC for things other than playing games, like making videos, I actually have a pretty damn good CPU, so the game ran mostly fine in the linear segments and during combat, but in the open world, it ran like shit. So if you take anything away from this review, unless you are a huge Star Wars fan, you should stay away from this game at launch. But for the purpose of this review, I'm going to pretend that performance is not a factor in gameplay. This is meant to be an actual review of the game, of its qualities, assuming the developers will eventually patch it. So without further ado, here's Star Wars Jedi Survivor. So as always, we're going to start off with gameplay first. Like I said, I didn't play the first game, so for those of you who did, some of this information you might already know, but we'll go over it anyway. This is essentially a half Souls-like, half generic cinematic action game, you know? Kind of like Sekiro Light combined with some Uncharted elements and a bit of Star Wars flair that you would probably expect. The basic combat boils down to breaking enemy stagger meters so that you can deal damage and execute them instantly in the case of some weaker enemies. Now, any enemy with a ranged weapon is significantly weaker and also doesn't have a stagger meter, so you can feel free to just reflect blaster bolts to kill them quickly, or usually one or two melee attacks will kill them. So luckily, I would say for the most part, basic enemy encounters are pretty fun and also surprisingly easy. And I have to tell you up front, I played this on hard mode, which I know I said I would never do that again. But I got bullied by chat, and some people who had played the game before me told me normal was too easy. And I would say 90% of the time they're absolutely correct. But the other 10%, well, let's just say this game is prone to random difficulty spikes. But we'll get into that a little bit later. Now, basic combat is simultaneously more complex, but arguably has less depth than Souls games. You have a lot more combat options, but roughly half of those options are basically cheat codes in the sense that they're just shortcuts to avoid having to parry or break the stance of every enemy you come across. They're a way of taking weaker enemies out of the fight instantly. The most obvious of these being force hold and force push, allowing you to pick up and throw basic enemy types straight off a cliff or into each other, or you can grab rockets or grenades and throw them into enemies, which is really satisfying. I don't think basic encounters are supposed to be challenging in this game. But as for force push specifically, it starts off way too weak. You can only push an enemy like 10 feet, but thankfully it can be upgraded. Of course, this is one of many AAA modern games with a skill tree, and you can make it significantly more powerful to push human-sized enemies across the screen and even stagger big enemies. You can also temporarily mind control enemies to fight with you, which is incredibly useful. And all of this is used by the force meter, which is regenerated by attacking enemies, killing them, and blocking attacks. And I almost forgot to mention there's also a super move that allows you to slow down all enemies around you until you hit them. I honestly forgot I even had this most of the time. It's not really fun to have a free win button for normal encounters. The game already gives you more than enough tools to deal with basic enemies, so I don't know why they felt the need to further casualize the Souls experience, but I guess you could just choose not to use it, as I did. As for your basic melee swings, it's just a very simplistic auto combo. This is one of those games where attacks glued to enemies, and for better or worse, it's actually extremely easy to get hit in this game because, and I would argue this is actually a good thing in most cases, enemies don't attack you one at a time. If you fight a group of enemies, you're going to have 3 or 4 guys shooting you, and then at least 1 or 2 strong melee enemies up in your face, and it's really hard to parry all of these things at the same time. And you have a block meter just for blocking, but parrying makes combat so much faster and actually is probably one of the most satisfying elements of the game, so you're going to be constantly tapping L1 and getting hit in between your blocks, or at least that's what happened to me a lot. Not to mention there's a copious amount of unblockable attacks in this game, especially whenever you're fighting one of these giant monster enemies. Now, of course, you have 2 other methods of avoiding attacks. The easiest one to guess would be the dodge, because this is a Souls-like, of course, there's going to be a dodge roll of some kind. Unfortunately, the dodge feels janky as fuck too, and part of this is just because you only dodge like 5 feet in a direction. And yes, you can double tap it, but then there's an extended delay before you can dodge again. It's not that long, but when enemies attack about as quickly as, say, Bloodborne, that lag between dodges really feels like it's forever, and sometimes the actual invincibility frames on your dodge are shorter than the amount of time an enemy's unblockable attack has a hitbox. This is where your third method of avoiding damage comes in, jumping. Another way this is kind of like Sekiro, or more recently, Elden Ring. And jumping to dodge attacks actually feels pretty damn good. It's more reliable than the dodge anyway, but it's also a bit slower, and at the time of me recording this, I didn't really have any good jump attacks, at least not for lightsaber stances I was using. And to talk about lightsaber stances for a moment, this was a pretty interesting element of the game, but because of the nature of the skill trees, you kind of have to commit to a couple stances you really like. Basically, the stances are the equivalent of a different weapon type in the Souls games. One is a long sword, one is dual-wielding 2 swords, another is a twin blade, and one you fight like a pirate, with your saber having rapier thrusts, and you have a blaster in your other hand, which I found to be the greatest of the stances by a significant margin, having very few weaknesses while being able to apply consistent pressure to stagger meters. Since you actually have a gun, you can shoot enemies when they dodge away from you, making it extremely useful against the humanoid bosses. So I really like that one. And the final one you get is a great sword, and even though I love great swords in these Souls games, the game is too fast for a weapon that swings this slow. Plus, it's a lightsaber, dude. It has no weight. It's a beam of light. Why are you swinging so goddamn slow? As you could probably guess, all 5 of these stances have different properties, they have different movesets, and like I mentioned before, they have their own skill trees as well. And this really felt like enough weapon variety for the game. I never felt at any point like I wanted more attacks. These 5 pretty much cover anything you would want to do in combat, and my only real complaints with them, other than the fact that you really feel like you have to commit to stances because of the lack of skill points, is that some of them just feel blatantly weaker than the other ones. You would think that the dual-wield sabers would do the most damage, but when I actually tested it against the Rancor boss early on, it pretty much did the same as a single-bladed saber, and it can't parry attacks. It can block, and you can hold triangle to do an auto parry at the cost of force energy, but it takes like a full second to charge up, and the attack animations are quite a bit long, even though you can cancel them with a block. It just felt like there was no real advantage to the dual-wield stance other than its one real gimmick to break blocks faster than the other ones, but I would argue that the blaster stance does it better, considering it can do it at range, and the thrust attacks are so much faster than the dual-wield sabers. So yeah, admittedly, this observation is not based on end-game skills, it's based on the mid-game, and I overwhelmingly used the blaster stance just because it was good at everything except crowd control. I'd say it takes about 8 hours for the combat to really start feeling fun, and then I was having a pretty good time, at least when I was in combat. Unfortunately, probably only about 40% of this game is actual gameplay, at least what I would consider gameplay. This is another one of those modern cinematic action games that has platforming puzzle sequences. This game relies a lot on Uncharted and Titanfall-esque parkour, and all that stuff just feels so automated. Running on walls requires no skill whatsoever. Climbing walls doesn't require skill. Pressing L2 to grapple every once in a while doesn't require skill. And I was tempted to call this a hidden loading screen, but honestly, the more I thought about it, the more I realized this is completely deliberate. I have no idea why they thought it was a good idea to put so many of these here. I would have rather had another 25% of the game be combat encounters that are arguably kind of repetitive or at least not unique, because that would be way more fun than climbing for the 50th fucking time across a linear level. It's just not fun, dude. It's like every 2 encounters they decide I need to climb another goddamn wall or solve another shitty puzzle. This is one of those games too, like God of War Ragnarok, that has shitty puzzles that add nothing to the game. Not once did I feel intelligent or satisfied by doing one of these puzzles. It felt like a waste of time, like padding. I swear, if you cut all of that shit out of this game, it would only be 8 hours long. It's sad because sometimes the game has a little bit of a Ratchet and Clank vibe, at least in the linear levels, where you can tell they tried putting some effort into the platforming to make it engaging, but when it requires no skill to do, just pressing a contextual button at the right time most of the time, it's annoying as shit. But anyway, to get back to the combat, I would say once it all comes together, it's fairly satisfying, but it does have one major issue, and that is just the general jankness of this game. I'm not going to pretend that Souls was always super smooth. People argue that Demon Souls and Dark Souls 1 are janky games, but at the very least, I would say 95% of the time, you know exactly how your character controls, you know exactly how long it takes to do a light swing or a heavy swing. You know generally how many attacks you can do with your stamina meter, how many attacks you can block, how far your dodge roll is, what the general amount of invincibility frames are. With this game, because it has that whole sliding attacking system, it feels far less reliable. You feel locked into attacks so much more. And I don't have a single problem with the game discouraging button mashing, because generally button mashing shouldn't be rewarded. But there's way too many times where I felt locked into a combo and you couldn't block or parry anything or dodge roll. And so I get hit by one of the various enemies all dogpiling me at the same time. And what makes the jankness even worse are the boss fights. I would say the boss fights against the humanoid enemies are actually pretty damn good. The developers managed to make each feel at least slightly unique, have different attack patterns and gimmicks that made it so you couldn't just tap L1 at the right time over and over again to win. Though the few times where that is the case, you really do have to learn the boss's attack patterns, and in those moments it feels satisfying. So I would say all the humanoid-sized boss fights were pretty fun to fight. Even if you get your ass kicked, you can usually afford to get hit 4 or 5 times, and again, this is on hard difficulty. I imagine anything below that is even easier, which felt like a decently appropriate level of challenge. But of course, now we get to the bullshit encounters, of which there are quite a few. We'll start with the lowest level of bullshit, which are generally the medium-sized monsters, I'll say. Now, for larger monsters in this game, basic lightsaber attacks do not do staggered damage, but you can still break their stagger meters by parrying enough attacks in a row, which varies in difficulty based on which monster it is, but it's still usually pretty doable. And the stagger opens them up for a few seconds, allowing you to do a lot of damage. So I think that's completely fine. I only have 2 problems with the medium-sized monsters, the first of which being that they can kill you in 2 to 3 hits, with their grab attacks doing like 2/3 or even 3/4 of your health bar, and often the grab attacks are fairly quick, with the only warning being their entire model glows red, which ironically kind of obscures the telegraphing of the attack animation, which is a problem when they have multiple unblockable attacks. And my other problem, and this is an even bigger issue with the boss monsters, is that your force powers are basically useless against them. You can stagger them after upgrading the force push, but it only does a little bit of meter damage. Confusion can work against some of them and make a battle go greatly in your favor if there's Imperials around, but a lot of the time it's just a 1v1 fight, so that doesn't really apply. And even the blaster stance, which is useful for almost everything, is quite a bit less useful against these guys, as some of them are immune to blaster bolts, or they just have such a fat health bar that it doesn't really do that much damage anyway. So even though not all of the monster types is super challenging, even the ones that aren't are just plain boring to fight, because half of your moves don't really work. But now we get to the giant monster boss fights. Every issue I had with the medium-sized ones is twice as bad with these giants. First, let's start off with the Rancor, which if you were there for the stream, you'll know took me like 20 fucking tries. And not because it was a fair challenge. No, it was bullshit. Half of the Rancor's moves could kill me in one hit. The worst of which being a grab attack that comes out incredibly quickly, and your little dash is pretty unreliable in dodging it, which leaves only your jump, and guess what? He grabbed me a couple times out of jumping too. And the hitbox is jank as fuck on that attack. Just take a look at this. What? What? You guys saw that, right? And it's not even like the Rancor was this super hard boss. It was just unfair. And it's a huge difficulty spike over everything else around it. And later on, I came across an even less fair boss, a giant frog, which had all of the same problems as the Rancor, but even worse. Even more health, and even more unblockable moves, and almost all of his attacks could kill me in 1 or 2 hits. And I actually did give up on fighting the frog because it was pretty apparent that I was too low a level to kill him. Future Synth Man here, in case you're curious, I did kill the frog eventually and discovered that he was a legendary creature, so I guess he was supposed to be basically an endgame boss. And I beat him by exploiting the blaster stance's charge shot, which interrupted any of his attacks, allowing me to get a few free hits on him. So I basically just burst damaged the shit out of him, and no, it wasn't satisfying in any way. It's just another classic example of bad boss design from these Souls-likes. Even though both the Rancor and this frog were optional open-world bosses, this game has slight Metroidvania elements. You have to come back to some areas with a new traversal ability that you get during the story, right? So why would you even allow me to fight the Rancor and the frog in the first place? But anyway, to wrap the core gameplay section up, I would say the combat is pretty solid, but it definitely still needed refinement. And the problem is, this is the second game in the series. This should have fine-tuned the gameplay and removed the jank. Not to mention the game runs like shit, like I said before. And I wish I could compare this more to the first game. I probably should have taken some time to play it, but to be honest, I would like this game even less if I did. I get the idea that based on some stream comments, this is very similar to the last one. So while I still had quite a bit of fun when the combat worked, and even though you get hit a lot of times that it feels like it's not really your fault, the game knows this and is generous most of the time, but I have to say deep down, I had this nagging question in the back of my head. Why is this a Souls-like in the first place? And I get the feeling the only answer to that question is just that when Jedi Fallen Order came out, Souls-likes were still pretty popular. And now that Elden Ring was a complete sensation last year, I figure we're going to get at least another 5 years of more Souls-like clones when this subgenre has already worn out its welcome. There's a lot of elements of this game that are not really worth talking about in depth, that are stolen directly from Souls that don't really need to exist in this game. Simple things like bonfires and how resting respawns all of the enemies, and if you die, you lose all of your EXP working up to the next skill point, and you have to recover it by either hitting the enemy that killed you, or sometimes it'll drop off nearby as a little glowing spot on the ground. The healing item also functions exactly like Estus flasks, and the only way to get them back is by resting. It's things like this that I don't think actually add anything to the game. They really don't. You could have just made this like a beat 'em up or hack and slash like the Force Unleashed games, and really just ham up how powerful you get. Maybe not as powerful as Starkiller, but having the kind of slow, methodical Souls combat actually just makes the game less fun to play. I want to feel way more powerful than my enemies because Jedi are supposed to be badasses. Some of the executions, while lacking any gore, and even the dismemberment is kind of disappointing, still make you feel like you're more badass than you actually are. Though speaking of executions, I would argue that also takes away from the Souls-like combat. A big part of why the Souls combat feels so good is how video gamey it is. Outside of backstabs and riposts, the Souls games try not to take control away from the player. Having 5-second long executions, especially when it's a medium-sized monster you've killed a bunch of times already, really isn't that satisfying. Now, to kind of wrap up all of the non-gameplay elements tightly into one section, because honestly, I don't really care enough about the other elements to talk about them in depth, I will say, as someone who used to be a casual Star Wars fan and now I don't really care anymore, I did appreciate a lot of the references to the prequels. Not just the battle droids, but they also got like one of Grievous's guards as a boss. There's one of those APCs from episode 1 on Naboo. I have no idea what they're called, but I used to have a Lego set of them, so that was kind of cool. The tutorial level is even on Coruscant, and as you're escaping, the surface looks a lot like the prequel movies. Of course, there's plenty of original trilogy stuff in there too, so I'm sure the few remaining Star Wars fans will eat this shit up. Who am I kidding? There's probably a bunch of millennials who can't let go of this shit. Just let Star Wars die, guys. As for the story, I'm not even gonna pretend I cared. I really didn't. The Last Ginger. That's what the story is truly about. We're the last surviving Ginger after the various genocides. Basically, Ginger and Lil Man have finally given up on fighting the good fight against the Empire and just want to find their little corner of the galaxy to hide out until it blows over, I guess? Definitely not a very inspiring story. This is the problem with setting any of these stories before the original movies. We already know how it's gonna end, so you can't kill any important characters, and the OC Donut Steel can't do anything truly important in this game. So the best thing the developers could come up with is to hide from your problems. Now, as you can tell, I haven't finished the game at the time of recording this. Honestly, I was kind of getting sick of the performance issues. But all of the characters have terrible writing. It's like that shitty Marvel humor, but even less funny. None of the characters really feel like they have any character. The only one I actually liked was your witch waifu. But the rest of the misfits just really felt like they had no identity. That's why I came to calling them Ginger and Lil Man. And I didn't even bother coming up with a code name for the bounty hunter or the forearm guy. And Deborah Wilson's character is just fucking Deborah Wilson. I don't need to call her anything else. I'm tired of seeing her face. Stop putting her in games. So yeah, when neither the characters nor the story are engaging, I just wanted to skip every cutscene. Thankfully, there really aren't that many. But unfortunately, like I said before, even when you're not in cutscenes, you're doing some stupid traversal challenge, platforming, loading screen crap, or a shitty puzzle. The combat is so little of the actual gameplay, and it's sad because I like the combat despite the jank. It's the only reason I kept playing the game. So, in conclusion, I basically already gave you the conclusion at the start. I don't need to tell you again, don't buy this now, just because of the performance issues. That overrides pretty much everything else. If you can't fucking play the game, don't buy the game. But even when they fix the game, I definitely think this is something you should buy at a discount. It just doesn't really offer anything unique. It just feels like a mix of Souls and Sekiro with any modern AAA cinematic action game. It has a lot of the same modern game poison that is shoved into everything. There's an open world that honestly is so basic it didn't really deserve its own section. They can't just fucking make linear games anymore. Or at the very least, if you're gonna make a non-linear game, how about somebody actually copy off of Dark Souls 1 and have a semi-linear world? If you're gonna bother to put in all of these shortcut doors everywhere, or zip lines, which only exist because you decided to put in bonfires instead of just having checkpoints, again, it adds nothing. Instead, we have yet another Souls-like. There are way too many of these, man. I haven't even played 10 of them, and I'm sick of them. The gameplay style of this game feels at war with itself. It's not refined enough to feel like a truly skill-based game that will make somebody want to beat it with a DDR mat or blindfolded or do a no-hit run or whatever, because the combat's too fucking jank, and a lot of that Souls-like stuff just feels at odds with being a badass Jedi, you know? I don't really think this should have been an action RPG Souls-like, but at least it's a decent one. It's definitely not one of the shittier ones I've played. I've definitely played way worse than this. Lords of the Fallen was probably the worst one, and by the same developer, The Surge was not very good either. Even Darksiders 3, which I like Darksiders, but that game wasn't that good either. So this is probably like mid-tier for a Souls-like. The combat is still pretty good. Enemies don't have too much health. You have a decently wide variety of different moves and abilities that makes the combat feel somewhat unique, at least compared to other Souls-likes. You still really feel like a Jedi, right? But the combat definitely still needed some tweaking. I will say again, I had fun, I did. But this game is nothing spectacular by any stretch. It certainly is better than a lot of other modern releases, because most modern releases are kinda boring or mediocre in some way. This one is at least decent, and once they iron out the performance issues, I'd say if you're a big Star Wars fan, you might as well pick it up on sale, right? But if you don't give a shit about Star Wars, just skip this one. You already know there's gonna be another 10 Souls-likes coming out in the next few years because of Elden Ring. So that's about it. See you next time, guys.